Hi and welcome. It's Jennifer Britton. Thanks for joining me for another Effective Virtual Conversations call. Today is a special topic that I've gotten a lot of requests around, neuroscience and virtual learning. So if this is the first time we're meeting, nice to meet you. Thanks for dropping in. This call is going to run for about 20 to 25 minutes, and it is based on my 2017 book, Effective Virtual Conversations. I've worked in the virtual and remote space for almost 3 decades now. In those days, we used to connect by long-range radio. And as we've seen the platforms change, as we've seen the different ways that we can work remote, certainly we also want to get very more conscious of how do we design great, memorable, and impactful conversations. I'm recording this in July 2020. In the last 4 months, billions of people all over the world have had to work remote, not by choice, but because of course, the impact of COVID. For most of us that have worked remote, it's not been a usual time. And even for those of us that are experienced, it's been interesting in learning how to navigate the different boundaries of our work. So I hope that you'll get some tips and ideas on things that you can apply to your team, in the learning programs that you design, or in the relationships that you create over time. My own background is quite varied. I spent 15 years working for international organizations, including the United Nations. I was always based across the Americas, Central and South America, and also did some work out of Europe. Typically, my teams were far away from me. And so if we weren't working face-to-face, chances were we had to come together in virtual platforms. In those days, we had Yahoo groups, we had the telephone. And so what you'll find is even though our platforms, as I said, continue to change, these tips are as relevant whether you are on a phone, instant message, uh, also Zoom. And I've been on Zoom now for almost 5 years. And certainly, yes, while we might experience Zoom fatigue, there are things that we can be doing to avoid that. So today's call really is against the backdrop of today's remote and virtual context, whether we're in a city or working very remote, which is where I am today. It is very typical to have meetings all day. We're moving from meeting to meeting to meeting. It means that also our boundaries are fluid. And for those of us that are parents, we may be navigating parental duties plus business duties and even older caretaker duties, as I've found in the last several months with my own parents. Another big context issue that I think we want to keep in mind, which makes the importance of having interactive virtual calls, is the fact that many of us are isolated physically and socially. One of the great impacts of this pandemic, I think, will be for many the impact on mental health and human health issues. And so what can we be doing in our virtual calls to be bringing people together, to helping them to connect with each other? Now, if this is the first Effective Virtual Conversations call that you have found, please check out the EVC, or Effective Virtual Conversations, playlist I host at my YouTube channel. You can look up my name, Jennifer J. Britton, on YouTube, and you will find more than 40 different EVC calls that I've hosted over the last 3 years. Some of those focus in on how do you create connection in the virtual space, others around how do you build trust. These are inherent issues that we really need to bring into the space, along with not only designing for neuroscience and virtual. So this has been an area of interest for me since I was an undergrad student way back in the late 80s studying at McGill University. In those days, it was the days before fMRIs. We couldn't really look at the brain as we do today, but at McGill, they were on the forefront. And I was blessed as a university, an undergrad student in those days, to focus in on really cognitive psychology, which is what we really call neuroscience today. So with that in mind, as I went to write Effective Virtual Conversations, I was doing additional graduate level studies in neuroscience on a MOOC basis, as well as leveraging into what I was seeing as a leader, a practitioner, and a learning professional. And that brought me to really include in EVC, in the design chapter, which is chapter 5 and 6, a little bit more on things that we want to consider as we're designing virtually. So this is Jo. Jo is, of course, our virtual facilitator in EVC. And in chapter 5 and 6, she reflects on 8 different things that we want to be including in better virtual design. Again, these are things that are very practical and tactical. I'm going to start at the 4 o'clock position, work our ways clockwise, because I'd like you to consider what are you doing or not doing in your programming right now. And the first one that is quite typical in the virtual space is the yearning for connectivity with others. And many times we see calls, we are just being talked at. How can you create moments where people get to activate what's known as the social brain, parts of the brain that get activated when we connect in with others? Now, there are lots of different options. We might be doing breakouts. We might also be working with colleagues on helping them think about peer partner opportunities in between calls. When we are able to bring our own self, our own experience, have windows of opportunity to talk about impact and application, that's really where learning happens. And it happens even greater if we can do that in a social way, connecting in and learning from the experiences of others. When I'm paired with perhaps Sujit and Joe and Jane, I can hear their ideas, and that's going to help inform where I decide to go. So social brain, think about that. The next one I want to talk about is positive interaction. And positive interaction is really based on the work of John Gottman, as well as Barbara Fredrickson. There's been a lot of studies over the years which have looked at what helps relationships and also teams excel. And what we know is that teams that excel typically have a stronger bias towards positive interactions where they get compliments, acknowledgments, just a high five virtually or other, versus the negative interaction. Now, it does not mean that we stop giving constructive feedback. In fact, the way I like to liken it is that, in fact, we need more frequent bursts of feedback. And if you take a look at part 3 of Effective Virtual Conversations back in chapter 9 and 10, I touch on more about the Revit model to feedback. Revit is a model that I've been sharing. It's one that I created where we really want to get teams into the practice of feeding forward and feeding back feedback. So it's got to be positive and constructive. And what Gottman found in his research, and this is published in a book called The Relationship Cure, he found a 5-to-1 ratio. So 5 positive interactions to every negative interaction. I think this is really important when we are in the virtual space, again, that we look at the balance of the positive to the constructive. It may be a little bit different than we're seeing each other face to face around the water cooler, etc. A third related area that I wanted to touch on today is micro moments. And this comes also from the work of Barbara Fredrickson. What she talks about is how that change is affected through these small micro windows. And I think this notion of micro is really key in today's world. We can be looking at the meta, at the big picture, but we also want to be looking at the more granular micro or nano windows. So think about, in a longer call, what are those micro moments where we can allow people to pause, have silence, maybe do some writing and reflection. Another way to focus on micro moments is to build in short bursts of interactivity. Interactivity, of course, in the virtual space could include polls, annotation, breakouts. So think about what you're going to be doing to intersperse your calls rather than just talking at. What are the micro moments? And I usually like to say every 7 to 10 minutes, can we be doing to change the pace? So we're going to change the pace right now. I've talked about 3 things. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to just take note of what might you do in your upcoming programming to look at enhancing the social brain and connection with others, to be encouraging people to think about both the positive and constructive feedback cycles more regularly, as well as what might you do to create more opportunity for micro moments. I'd invite you to grab your notebook. And again, one that's not here, but that we really also see is a need for analog. So here's my analog notebook for the summer. And I'm going to take some notes as well. We'll take about 30 seconds just to write down what might you do to enhance your virtual conversations in these 3 areas. All right. So we're going to move on to the next two, the PEA, NEA, and that is comes from the work of primarily Richard Boyatzis and his team, where they've studied what happens when we ask different questions to others. So we have questions like, what's possible? If you were to win $50 million in a lotto, what would you do? Or if you were to wave a magic wand, what's possible? What's available to you? What Boyatzis and his team has found is that questions, in fact, either open up the brain. There is a whole series of brain elements, which is called the positive emotional attractor network, which literally opens the brain. And when we activate the PEA, it is typically with these open-ended questions that really take people into the land of possibility. In contrast, we can literally create a trap for the brain or snap it shut when we activate the NEA, the negative emotional attractor network, which is activated when we ask questions for justification, like, why? Why did you do that? So think about how the way you're asking questions can either activate the brain or shut it down. And I think this is definitely an area, whether I'm speaking with HR professionals, coaches, leaders, or team members, we can all benefit by getting better at questioning. So that's PEA, NEA. The next one is mirror neurons. And in mirror neurons, it really is like you see it. We start to mirror those we are surrounded with. Now, up to this point, I think a lot of the research has been focused in on the face-to-face realm. What's been interesting in the last few months is there's been a tsunami of opportunities for many of these research factors to be looked at more in depth in a virtual space. So what does happen with what's often called synchrony? Do we start to mimic and mirror those we're surrounded with? I would assert that if we're spending most of the day with our team virtually co-working, yes, that might be our locus of control. Think about how often you raise your eyes beyond the screen. And in fact, an exercise that I write about in chapter 7 of Effective Virtual Conversations gets people to think about what's outside their window. I've been asking this question for almost 5 years now, and it's amazing how people, like, you can literally see the, oh yeah, there's a window outside of my window, my screen window. So think about mirror neurons, think about PEA, NEA. What are the questions you're using to open up or close down? And some of the things we might be doing might actually be activating the amygdala hijack, or what's known as the fight or flight response. We can also freeze. And typically, even the way we ask questions, once again, might put people into a, I want to, really get into an argument because you're asking me using a why question to really put me on the defensive. Or perhaps I'm running away because the question is not appropriate. The question is actually going a little bit deeper than the trust levels we have. I want to give you another 30 seconds here to really think about what you're doing in these three areas around fight or flight, mirror neurons, and the PEA, NEA. Think about the types of questions you're asking, and perhaps even 2 or 3 that you might want to be asking more frequently. Let's take a few seconds to write that down. All right, I've included 3 questions that I'm going to share with you right now. 3 that I really like to use at different stages. So what's possible? I've mentioned that. Of course, it opens up the brain. Another question I like to ask early on into a conversation is what's important about that? And that question really gets people thinking about, the bigger picture, that meta view. When we go to that 30,000-foot view, we're able to see the landscape of things. As many of you know, my podcast is called Remote Pathways, and it really was influenced by realizing, what, as much as like we term remote, it really is about multiple pathways. As I sat down to start writing this in summer of 2019, it became very apparent that there are multiple pathways, and we focus on 12 different pathways called the digital dozen, from remotepreneurs to project managers who work remote to virtual facilitators like Joe and new virtual team leaders like Jane. We also have Alex, who works in the voluntary sector, as well as Ned, who is new to remote work. So think about what you could be doing to invite people to think about like what's important about that, or if you're having to dig into questions or dig into issues with folks, what else? Again, we have an affinity to start advising people rather than asking questions. And in the remote space, it's so important that we really lead by influence and that we use questions to help create new knowledge in those that we're meeting with. All right, so we're almost our way through this area of these 8. The next one I want to share with you actually comes from probably my third-year psychology professor. It's known as the latency and recency effects. And this is also known as the start and end of things. Our brain remembers the beginning and the end. Everything in the middle gets lost. It's no surprise we have books called The Messy Middle. And really, it's the start and end that gets remembered. So we've all heard some of those factoids, like you've got 7 seconds to make a first impression. Well, in the virtual space, you've got a limited amount of time, probably a minute or less, to 1, signal what the call is about, 2, connect people into what's important about that topic for them, and to 3, signal that this is not just going to be another Zoom fatigue meeting. So what are you doing to signal at the start of your calls that this is going to be different, how it helps people connect in with the topic, and finally, what they can expect in the upcoming call? At the same time, we've got to think about the end, because if we are wanting to reinforce learning and hopefully make sure that it transfers from online to the real world, what are the things we're doing to make sure that that transfer happens? And this is where leaving some time, as we've been doing today, to stop, pause, take notes. Hopefully it's in a place which is visible and which is looked at. So whether you want to do a worksheet or just encourage people to write it down in a journal, the end of things is just as important. It's very likely that people will be moving on to another call right away. So what can you be doing to ensure that you leave 30 seconds or 3 minutes for people to note it down, schedule it, and lock it in before that learning opportunity is lost? Now, in that messy middle point at the bottom, really be thinking about what you can do to anchor key learnings. You might even say something as simple as, well, we're halfway through our call. Make sure you take note of what you've noticed, or is there anything you want to note right now? One more area so that's latency and recency effect. We remember the start and end of things, the things in the middle, often forgotten. Oxytocin is the next one. And with oxytocin, it really is all about what are the things we can do to create more affinity and bonding with others. With oxytocin, it's thinking about how do we create that bond. And there is this neurochemical that's called the bonding chemical, which is all about getting teams, or it's often seen in parents and children, but in teams, if we can get people to touch and sense each other, it really can help to boost that. And of course, that's part of key, which is key to affinity. How do I feel membership in a team? How do I feel connected with a team? With oxytocin, you do want to think about how do you connect in. Also, how do you make sure that you are focused in on the things that are important to the team? So with oxytocin, be sure to schedule time which is bonding. This has not been seen in the virtual domain. So this is something that I think there's going to be further research around. It's very hard to do other than a virtual high five. All we could really be doing is building in time for team practices and team connection. So there we go with our 8. I want to give you one last minute or 30 seconds to note down what you might include around latency and recency, as well as oxytocin. All right, for more on this entire topic, do check out the design chapter of Effective Virtual Conversations. That is chapter 6. You can pick up a copy of the book in Kindle or hard copy at your local Amazon. And with that, let's go to the Pebbles, etc. model. I want to wrap up with this, and to really talk about design, I think it's important that we keep a number of things in mind. Again, we want to create memorability and application. And that's one reason why Pebbles, etc. does have a typo. You might have read it and said, but wait, something's wrong there. And in fact, the mnemonic, which is simply a way to just remember a large amount of information, is incorrectly spelled, just so you could remember it. There's not 2 L's in Pebbles, there's just 1. So with that, let's walk through this. And I'd like you to think about what can you do to incorporate these into your next webinar, virtual group coaching session, or other virtual event. First, prep and practice. What are you doing to prepare people for the call? Is there pre-work? Is there anything they need to watch, listen, or read? And are you building in practice opportunities, whether that is an opportunity to do it during the call or other? Now that's for our participants, but also for us as facilitators. Are you prepared? Have you practiced it? Do you really know how much time it's going to take? Today, there's only 2 slides because I know that these take a long time. We also want to be clear on expectations. And many of you know that one of the most important things I like to include is a discussion around what is important with the participants. The third area is breakouts. I've touched on breakouts, and there's another call called Breakouts that Sizzle. And breakouts are a great way to get people connected in the room and in smaller groups. Make sure that you leave enough time, and don't try to give more than 5 people per breakout. The next B is brain-based. Brain-based is all of what we've talked about. What might you be doing to incorporate these elements or other elements? L, less is more. Similar to the comment I've just made, I included only 2 slides today of content because less truly is more. It's not about including so much that people feel overwhelmed. And when we're learning virtually, we want to make sure that we're leaving those opportunity moments for people to think about how they can loop it back or link it back to the workplace. I've done that today by asking you to think about and write down your ideas with a bit of a pause. Now, another big thing that happens virtually, you've probably experienced this, is expect the unexpected. Whether the phone line goes down or someone drops in, what is the thing that's going to help you really keep moving? And we want to embrace that. We don't want to get hung up on it. The next one is S, set people up for success. And in setting people up for success, it really is about thinking through, how do we have the best conversations? What can we do to make sure that they are prepared and ready and focused for the conversation? It might even mean leaving a quick pause point for a few minutes to get people grounded as they come onto the call. The E for etc. is embrace the chaos. Don't try to fight a lot of the things that are inevitably going to happen around you. It's unlikely that virtual calls are going to be perfect. So embrace it. You can really define that for yourself, that I've learned that even in chaos, there are patterns. Follow the patterns. T stands for tools and resources. And I think this is where we want to build up our toolkit. As you may know, there's lots of resources available to you, both free and paid. Of course, check out the remotepathways.com blog. I do a weekly tool there that is available for download. You can also check out Remote Pathways podcast on your podcast player. And many of the tools that I've used with remote teams are available for purchase over at potentialsrealize.com. Of course, that's my main website, potentialsrealize.com. There's a store there. Our digital cards, our ebooks around how to work with visual cards, ebooks around virtual and remote team development, all can be found at the potentialsrealized.com store. Finally, we want to create clarity, clarity of process, clarity of words, and clarity of even time. Clarity is key, and you might notice that is one of the key words in the 7 remote enablers. So we've covered a lot today, and my hope is that you will think about how you're going to apply the Pebbles, etc. model. Maybe you decide to do some work with me one-on-one. Increasingly, a lot of folks have been joining me for what I call VIP days, where we work together real time for half a day or one day. And it may be a blend of coaching and also mentoring and real-time work for you. Our annual labs are continuing the Coaching Biz Growth Lab, which focuses on business development, the Learning Lab and Design Studio, which focuses on group coaching, and the Remote Professional Lab, which is going to be starting in September. So stay tuned, reach out. Now, if you're a coach and you want ICF CCE approved programming, check out the Group and Team Coaching Program, Virtual Facilitation Essentials, and also PlanDoTrack. And with that, there's lots more to be learning in this area. There are lots of group development issues. There's a whole recording on Tuckman's model and lots of other areas to consider. So I'd like you to think about what's important in your work. What are the things that are going to move you ahead? How do you make it visual? How do you keep it simple? How do you engage? And remember, it's always all about the conversation. So thank you for spending time with me today. Again, pick up a copy of Effective Virtual Conversations over at Amazon. If you have not picked up a copy of the Remote Working White Paper, definitely do that. Everything is magnified here in the remote space. The Remote Working White Paper can be found at bit.ly.com/remote work white paper. And with that, I want to say thank you. I'm back again next week for another call. Note that that call is going to be at a special time. Just going to go to my calendar. It's going to start at 9 o'clock. And we are going to look at the 7 remote enablers. So hope you'll join me. And with that, have a great week. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.